The first thing she noticed was the toothpaste, not the silence, not the fact that I had stopped asking where she was going every Thursday night even, though she always wore the same black coat and the same perfume that smelled colder than usual when she came back. Not the fact that I no longer reached for her in bed. It was the toothpaste. She stood in the bathroom doorway with one hand still wrapped around her phone, staring at the sink like something had been moved by an intruder. The apartment was quiet except for the hum inside the wall behind the mirror cabinet. That old electrical vibration that sounded almost like whispering if you listened too long. I was shaving. Slowly. Very slowly. The foam sat heavy on my jaw while the razor dragged downward in careful stroke. She kept staring at the sink. Then she said, "You changed toothpaste," not accusing. Not curious. Worse. Distracted. Like the observation barely mattered. Like I barely mattered. I looked at her reflection through the mirror. Her hair was still damp from the shower, one side darker than the other. A faint crease on her cheek from sleeping against the pillow. She looked beautiful in the way exhausted people sometimes do. Soft around the edges. Human enough to make you forget how cruel they could be accidentally. "Yeah," I said. She blinked once. "You hate mint, I know." Another pause. Then her shoulders lifted slightly. "Okay, that was it. Okay," she left. The hallway floor creaked beneath her feet in 3 familiar places. One near the kitchen. One outside the bedroom. One beside the radiator. I listened until the sounds disappeared. Then I kept shaving. Very slowly. Because my hand was shaking. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But enough that I could feel the tiny vibrations traveling from my fingers into the razor blade. Enough to know something had already started. The thing about changing yourself quietly is that nobody applauds. Nobody notices the violence involved. They think transformation is dramatic, explosive. They think people change through revelations or breakdowns or screaming matches in the rain. But real change is microscopic. It starts in private, in silence, in humiliation. It starts when you realize the person looking at you has already decided who you are permanently. And worse, they're comfortable with it. That was the part I couldn't survive anymore. Not her disappointment, not even her boredom. Her certainty. That absolute casual certainty. Like my entire personality had fossilized in front of her. Like I was a chair she sat in every day without thinking. Predictable. Permanent. Stable. Dead. I rinsed the razor. Cold water spiraled pink around the drain. My face looked unfamiliar without the beard. Thinner. Sharper. Older around the eyes. For a second, I didn't recognize myself at all. And the strangest part was that frightened me less than being recognizable. Behind me, I heard cabinet doors opening in the kitchen. Coffee mugs touching. The fridge seal peeling loose with a wet suction sound. Ordinary sound. Married sound. The soundtrack of 2 people slowly becoming furniture in each other's lives. I dried my face carefully. Every motion deliberate. Because I had started noticing something recently. When people think they fully understand you, they stop watching. And once they stop watching, you can disappear right in front of them. At breakfast, she looked at me 3 separate times before realizing I'd shaved. 3. I counted. First time her eyes slid over my face while she poured coffee. The second time while unlocking her phone. The third time while chewing toast. That was when her gaze paused. Her forehead tightened slightly. Oh, I looked up from my plate. "What, you shaved?" I nodded once. She stared another second too long. Not because she liked it. Because it unsettled her. People don't enjoy unexpected changes in familiar things. Especially small ones. Small changes imply hidden movement underneath. "You look different," she said. I almost laughed. Different. As if that was all. As if my entire interior wasn't splitting open beneath my ribs every minute I sat across from her. As if I hadn't spent the last 4 months waking up beside her feeling like someone slowly being erased with a damp cloth. I took a sip of coffee. "It's just a beard," but she kept looking. Not at me. At the absent. At the missing version of me she had memorized. And for one brief, poisonous moment, I felt powerful. That terrified me more than anything. Because power can become addictive very quickly when you've spent years feeling invisible. She left for work at 8:12. Same as always. Same kiss on the cheek. Same distracted love you already halfway out the door. But this time, when the lock clicked shut behind her, I didn't immediately exhale the way I usually did. Usually her absence relaxed me. The apartment became breathable again. But now the silence felt charged, like the room itself knew something had shifted. I stood in the kitchen alone, coffee cooling in my hand, the refrigerator humming softly. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythm. And suddenly I became aware of my own body with unbearable clarity. The weight distribution in my feet, the tension in my jaw, the stiffness in my neck, my pulse. I could feel my pulse everywhere. In my throat, wrist, eyes, like my body had been asleep for years and was only now reconnecting itself nerve by nerve. I walked to the bathroom again, looked at myself, longer this time. There are moments where identity stops feeling stable. Most people never admit it, but everyone has experienced it at least once. You catch yourself in a mirror unexpectedly and something disconnects. Not dramatically, quietly. Tiny fracture between the person looking and the person being looked at. That morning the fracture widened, because I realized something horrifying. I had spent years performing a version of myself specifically designed to keep her comfortable. Not happy. Comfortable. There's a difference. Happy requires attention. Comfort only requires predictability. And predictability kills curiosity first, then respect, then desire. I touched my bare jaw again. The skin felt cold, unprotected, raw. My reflection looked like someone pretending to be me. I whispered, "What if she's right?" The bathroom swallowed the words immediately. No answer came back, only the electrical hum in the walls. That whispering sound again. I started changing things after that. Tiny things first, small enough to avoid confrontation. Different coffee, different posture, different route home from work. I stopped explaining myself automatically. That one disturbed her the fastest. People get uncomfortable when access disappears gradually, especially if they never realized they depended on it. 3 nights later, she asked, "Are you okay?" We were eating takeout on the couch. The television glowed across her face in pale blue flashes. Some crime show neither of us were watching. I looked at her. "What do you mean, you've just been?" Well, she hesitated, searching. That mattered. The hesitation mattered, because she had always been able to define me instantly before. Funny, tired, moody, sensitive, predictable words, ready-made categories. But now she was searching. "Quiet," she finished. I almost said, "You mean absent. You mean inaccessible. You mean you can't feel the walls of me anymore." But instead I shrugged. Tired, she nodded too quickly. Relieved by the simplicity. People love explanations that restore order. She leaned against me afterward. Warm, familiar, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. And I felt absolutely nothing. No, that's not true. I felt something worse than nothing. I felt observation, distance, like I was studying intimacy instead of experiencing it. I became aware of the exact pressure of her skull against my arm, the heat through her sweater, the rhythm of her breathing. I noticed how automatically my body adjusted to accommodate hers. Years of unconscious choreography, and suddenly the whole thing felt mechanical. Practice, terrifyingly practiced. I stared at the television light flickering across the room, and a thought entered my head so suddenly it almost made me nauseous. How long have I been gone without realizing it? The next morning I bought new clothes. Nothing dramatic. That was important. Real psychological shifts happen beneath the threshold of obviousness. A darker coat, shoes with harder soles, button-down shirts instead of sweaters. Subtle changes, but each one felt strangely irreversible. Like placing bricks into a wall I didn't fully understand yet. The cashier smiled at me while folding the shirt. "You look like someone starting a new job." I smiled back automatically. Something like that, but the sentence followed me all the way home. Because I realized I was. The job was becoming someone she couldn't predict anymore. And I didn't know if I was qualified, or sane enough to continue. That evening she noticed the clothes immediately. Again, not because they were dramatic, because they interrupted expectation. "You went shopping?" "Yeah, for what?" I looked up from untying my shoes. The question sat strangely in the room. not aggressive, but not casual either. For what? As if purchases required narrative approval. As if change needed justification. I needed clothes, you had clothes, there it was. Tiny, barely visible, but there, resistant. I stood slowly. My new shoes made a firmer sound against the floorboard. A stupid detail, but I noticed her noticing it. I wanted different ones. She stared at me for half a second too long, then laughed softly, not mocking, uneasy. Okay, okay again. That word was becoming dangerous, because every time she said it, what she meant was, return to normal. Explain yourself. Re-enter the shape I recognized. But I couldn't anymore. That was the problem. Something had already detached inside me, like a bolt coming loose deep within a machine. And now every movement produced strain. That night I woke at 3:17 a.m. The room was dark except for streetlight bleeding through the curtains. Beside me, she slept on her stomach with one arm under the pillow, breathing slowly, peacefully. I stared at the ceiling, completely awake. The apartment made its usual night noises, pipes clicking, buildings settling, distant elevator cables groaning somewhere below. And beneath all of it, the silence between us. Not external silence, structural silence, kind built from accumulated avoidance. Years of conversations never fully completed. Resentments softened before confrontation. Needs translated into politeness until they no longer sounded human. I turned my head toward her, studied her face in the dark. I tried to remember the last time she had really looked at me. Not glanced, not interacted. Looked at. I couldn't. That realization spread through my chest slowly, like cold water filling lungs. Then another thought arrived immediately after. When was the last time I looked at her honestly? Not through memory, not through routine, not through obligation. Honestly. Her mouth moved slightly in sleep, a tiny unconscious twitch, and suddenly she felt impossibly far away. Not physically, existentially. Like we were two strangers performing the final stage of a relationship neither of us knew how to leave. I got out of bed quietly, went to the kitchen, didn't turn on the light. The refrigerator glow filled the apartment when I opened it. Pale, artificial. I stood there barefoot staring into cold shelves without hunger. And that was when the thought finally formed completely. Not sudden, not dramatic, just complete. I could become someone else. The idea should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt relieving, horribly relieving, like discovering a hidden exit inside a burning building. I leaned against the counter, heart beating harder now, because once that possibility exists, normal life becomes unbearable. You start seeing every habit as optional, every reaction as constructed, every personality trait as repetition. I thought about the way I laughed around her, the way I apologized too quickly, the way I softened my opinions before speaking, the way I anticipated her moods before my own. How much of that was love? How much was adaptation? And if adaptation lasts long enough, does it become identity? The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. I pressed both palms against the counter edge until the pressure hurt, trying to feel anchored inside my own body. But something was slipping. Not emotionally, structurally, like the architecture of selfhood was quietly deforming underneath me. Behind me, I heard movement in the bedroom. Then footsteps, slow, sleep-heavy. She appeared in the doorway, rubbing one eye. "What are you doing?" Her voice was soft, suspicious only underneath the softness. I looked at her across the darkness. "Couldn't sleep," she nodded. Then she just stood there, watching me. I realized suddenly that she looked frightened. Not consciously, instinctively, like animals sensing atmospheric pressure before storms. "You're acting weird lately," she whispered. There it was, finally. Not quiet, not tired. Weird. Meaning unfamiliar. Meaning uncontrollable. Meaning no longer emotionally organized around her expectation. I should have reassured her. That's what the old version of me would have done instantly. Smile softly, pull her close, explain everything away. But I didn't move, and the longer I stayed still, the more the room changed. Tension gathered invisibly, like static, I'm just thinking a lot, I said finally. About what, everything? Nothing. Who I am when you're not looking at me. Who you forced me to become. Who I allowed myself to become. Instead, I shrugged. She crossed her arms unconsciously. Defensive posture. Tiny. Automatic. You can talk to me, I almost said. Can I? Because that was the real horror underneath all of it. Not that she misunderstood me. That eventually I had trained myself not to say things she wouldn't know how to hold. That's how relationships rot sometimes. Not through cruelty. Through filtration. You edit yourself for peace until peace becomes emptiness. I know, I said, but even to me it sounded false. She stared another second, then nodded slowly, and went back to bed. I stayed in the kitchen long after she disappeared. The refrigerator motor clicked off eventually. The silence afterward felt enormous, and for the first time in years, I realized I was afraid of her. Not physically, psychologically. Afraid of the gravitational force she had on my identity. Afraid that if I stopped resisting, I would dissolve back into the version of myself she found easiest to manage. The next week became unbearable in microscopic ways. Every interaction felt layered. Every silence crowded. She began studying me constantly, without wanting to admit she was doing it. I caught her watching me while I tied my shoes, while I answered emails, while I brushed my teeth, trying to determine whether the changes were temporary, trying to locate the edge of this new behavior. But that was the problem. There was no edge anymore, because I had started changing internally faster than externally. And she could feel it. People always can, even before evidence appears. One evening she asked, "Did something happen?" We were folding laundry. A domestic ritual so ordinary it almost felt theatrical. Warm clothes piled between us, drier heat fading slowly into the room. I folded a shirt carefully. "No, you'd tell me if something happened, right?" The question tightened something inside my stomach. Because it wasn't really a question. It was a request for restoration. Tell me the narrative. Return to emotional transparency. Become legible again. I kept folding. Probably her hands stopped moving. Probably. One word. Tiny. But it landed like broken glass between us. She stared at me openly now. "What does that mean?" I looked up, and suddenly I could see exactly how this would unfold if I let it. Conversation. Clarification. Comfort. Repair. Return. The machine resetting itself. And I couldn't survive that. Not anymore. So instead I said, I don't know which was true. Terrifyingly true. Because the deeper this went, the less stable my own thoughts became. At work I started staying later. Not because I needed to. Because I dreaded going home before understanding what was happening to me. The office after hours felt strangely peaceful. Empty desk. Low fluorescent buzzing. Computer monitors sleeping in dark rows. Place without emotional demand. One night my coworker Daniel paused beside my desk while putting on his coat. "You heading out in a bit?" He nodded toward me. "You look different lately," I forced a smile. "Different how?" He shrugged. Sharper, the word stayed with me after he left. Sharper. Not happier. Not healthier. Sharper. Like something being honed. I sat alone beneath the office, lights listening to the ventilation system breathe through the ceiling. And slowly, very slowly, I began entertaining thoughts I should have rejected immediately. What if personality is mostly repetition? What if people only stay consistent because others reinforce the same version of them daily? What if identity itself is collaborative imprisonment? The thoughts felt dangerous, but also intoxicating. Because if identity could be dismantled, then maybe pain could too. Maybe humiliation, dependency, fear, maybe all of it. I started reading obsessively after that. Psychology, behavioral conditioning, personality fragmentation, cognitive restructuring. I stayed awake until dawn some nights, absorbing theories like a starving man. The apartment glowed blue from my laptop screen while she slept beside me unaware. Or pretending to be unaware. That distinction mattered less and less. One night she woke and looked at the screen. "What are you reading?" "Nothing. You've been saying nothing a lot lately." There was no anger in it. That made it worse. Only exhaust. I closed the laptop slowly. The darkness afterward felt immediate and thick. "You said I'd never change," I whispered. The sentence escaped before I could stop it. Silence. I felt her turn toward me in bed. When did I say that? But she already remembered. I could hear it in her voice. 3 months earlier. After an argument. One of those circular relationship autopsies where both people speak from accumulated resentment instead of present reality. You never change. I'd forgotten the fight itself, but not the sentence. Never. Such a small word. Absolute words destroy people quietly. You always do this, she said carefully now. You take one thing and what? Her breathing changed. I could hear it. Slightly faster. You disappear into it, disappear. Interesting choice. Like she had noticed the vanishing long before I had. I stared into darkness. And what if I changed completely? The room went still. Not silent. Still. Even the air seemed to tighten. That's not how people work, she said eventually. There it was again. Certainty, the prison. And suddenly anger moved through me so fast it almost felt chemical. Not explosive anger. Worse. Cold anger. The kind that sharpens instead of burns. How do people work? I asked. She sighed softly. You know what I mean, no. Explain it. Now she was fully awake. I could feel it. The tension, the caution. We grow, she said slowly. But we stay who we are, who we are. I almost laughed into the darkness, because I no longer knew what that sentence meant. And the more I searched internally for a stable self, the less I found. Only reaction. Adaptation. Performances. Fear responses. Copied behaviors. Masks layered over older masks. What if there's nobody underneath? I whispered. She didn't answer immediately. And in that pause I realized she was afraid of me. Not because I sounded dangerous, because I sounded unreachable. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Softer, careful. You need sleep, not engagement, not understanding. Reduction. Translate the existential into the manageable. Exhaustion, stress, temporary instability. I turned away from her, and something inside me hardened permanently. Not because she failed, because I suddenly understood no one could follow me where my mind was going. The next morning she kissed me goodbye and held the kiss half a second longer than usual. Testing something. Searching. I let her. But internally I felt detached from the interaction completely. Like watching surveillance footage of intimacy. After she left, I stood motionless in the apartment. Then I walked to the closet, opened it, and stared at my clothes. Rows of identical versions of myself. Same colors, same textures, same safe personality repeated in fabric form. My chest tightened suddenly, violently. Not panic, revulsion. I started pulling hangers down, one after another. Shirts, sweaters, jackets. They hit the floor in heavy collapsing piles. I breathed harder, faster. Something was happening, something irreversible. The room felt distorted around the edges. Too bright, too narrow. I grabbed a sweater she once said made me look approachable, held it, stared at it, and for one horrifying second, I couldn't remember whether I had ever actually liked it, or whether I'd simply worn it long enough to mistake repetition for preference. That thought cracked something open. I sat on the floor surrounded by collapsed clothing, while my heartbeat slammed against my ribs. Identity distortion doesn't happen all at once. It happens in waves. Moments where familiar things suddenly lose emotional ownership. Your handwriting, your voice, your routine, your face. Everything starts feeling inherited instead of chosen. And once that process starts, reality becomes unstable in terrifying ways. Because if the self is editable, then what exactly has been living your life until now? I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes maybe longer. The apartment remained painfully quiet around me. Then my phone vibrated. Her name, a message. Did you take the blue folder from the shelf? I stared at the text. Simple, ordinary, domestic. And suddenly tears filled my eyes so fast it frightened me. Because the normalcy felt unbearable now. Like someone trying to continue a conversation calmly while a building burns behind them. I typed no, then erased, typed again. Haven't seen it. Send. My hands were trembling. Not from sadness, from dissociation. I no longer felt synchronized with my own life. Like I had stepped half an inch outside myself and couldn't get back in. The phone buzzed again. Okay. Love you. I stared at those words for a very long time. Then I turned the phone face down on the floor beside me. And for the first time, I didn't say it back. The silence after that message did not feel accidental. It felt structural, like a beam had cracked somewhere deep inside the architecture of our relationship, and neither of us wanted to look directly at it yet. I stayed on the bedroom floor, surrounded by clothes that no longer felt like mine. The apartment air felt stale, heavy. The radiator hissed intermittently like something breathing through damaged lung. Outside, rain dragged across the windows in long, uneven streaks that distorted the city lights into smeared vertical wounds. I stared at my own hands, palms open against my knees, and slowly, carefully, I tried to identify what exactly had changed inside me. Not emotionally. Emotion was too vague now. This felt more mechanical than emotional, like a gear slipping loose somewhere behind consciousness. The frightening thing was that I could still function perfectly. Go to work, answer questions, smile, make coffee. But underneath those actions, something had detached from meaning. I could feel it constantly. A fraction of a second between impulse and behavior, a delay. As if my mind was no longer fully convinced the person performing my life was actually me. My phone vibrated again. This time I didn't look. I already knew what would happen if I did. A normal message. Another ordinary exchange. And I would either respond correctly and feel myself disappear further, or fail to respond correctly and watch suspicion grow in her eyes. Both options exhausted me. I leaned my head back against the closet door, closed my eyes, and suddenly I heard her voice from months ago with unbearable clarity. You always become whatever people need from you, not during a fight. Worse, during one of those soft late-night conversations where honesty slips out because both people are too tired to defend themselves properly. At the time, I thought she meant it affectionately. Now I wasn't sure. Maybe she had been describing a flaw. Or maybe warning me. The problem with becoming adaptable for too long is that eventually you lose the ability to detect your original shape. Every reaction becomes collaborative. Every opinion becomes negotiated. You stop asking yourself what you feel because anticipating other people becomes faster, safer, more efficient, and eventually automatic. That realization poisoned everything after it, because now every memory felt contaminated. Did I really love certain movies? Or had I absorbed her taste slowly enough to mistake it for mine? Did I actually dislike crowded bars? Or had I repeated it enough times that the preference calcified into personality? How much of me existed independently at all? I opened my eyes again. The room looked wrong. Not visually wrong. Psychologically wrong. Like a set built to resemble my life, the bookshelf, the framed photograph, the lamp she bought at the flea market 3 years ago because she said it made the apartment feel warmer. Suddenly all of it looked staged. Evidence of a character, not a self. My breathing became shallow. I stood too quickly. The blood rush distorted the room for half a second. Then I was moving through the apartment without direction. Kitchen, hallway, living room, back again. I could feel energy building inside my body with nowhere to go. Not anger, pressure, pure psychological pressure. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror. The shaved face still unsettled me, but now even my expressions looked artificial. I smiled experimentally. The smile looked delayed, manufactured, like a stranger imitating human warmth. I stopped immediately. A thought entered my mind so abruptly it felt inserted. What if she noticed before I did? That possibility hollowed me out instantly. What if the exhaustion in her eyes lately wasn't confusion, but recognition? What if she had already realized the version of me she loved was mostly responsiveness? What if my personality had always depended on being observed? The apartment suddenly felt airless. I grabbed my coat and left without thinking. Outside, the rain had weakened into mist. The city looked colorless. Streetlights blighting through wet pavement. People moving beneath umbrellas like disconnected fragments of darker shape. I walked fast, no destination. Just movement. The cold air helped initially. It gave my thoughts edges again. But the farther I walked, the stranger my body began to feel. My posture, my gait, the rhythm of my step. I became hyper-aware of every movement. as if I were manually controlling actions that should have been automatic. There's a point during psychological unraveling where self-awareness becomes parasitic. You stop experiencing yourself naturally. You monitor yourself experiencing yourself. An endless hall of mirrors. I passed a restaurant window and caught my reflection moving beside strangers inside. For one horrifying second, I genuinely didn't recognize myself. Not metaphorically, literally. My stomach dropped so hard I stopped walking. The reflection stopped too. Rainwater shimmered across the glass. Cars moved behind me in distorted streaks of light. And there I was. That face, those shoulders, that body. Mine. Supposedly mine. But emotionally disconnected from ownership. A man wearing my history without my certainty. I stood there too long. A couple exiting the restaurant glanced at me uneasily before walking faster. I realized then that my expression must look frightening. Not angry. Lost. There's something deeply disturbing about people who appear internally disconnected from their surroundings. Animals recognize it instantly. Humans do too. I kept walking. Faster now. As if movement itself could outrun thought. By the time I reached home again, my clothes were damp and cold. The apartment lights were on. My chest tightened immediately. She was back. I unlocked the door. The smell of food hit me first. Garlic, onions, wine sauce reducing slowly somewhere. Normal, domestic, kind of smell that should have comforted me. Instead, it made me feel trapped. She stood in the kitchen, stirring something in a pan. When she looked up and saw me, relief crossed her face so quickly it almost hurt to witness. Jesus, she said softly. Where were you? Her tone was careful. Too careful. I took off my coat slowly. Walking for 3 hours, I hadn't realized it had been that long. The realization disturbed me. Time had started behaving strangely lately. Stretching, collapsing, moments expanding until they felt unbearable. Then entire hours vanishing without texture. I lost track, she nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on me. Studying, measuring. You didn't answer your phone, I know, silent. The pan hissed softly behind her. Something metallic ticked as it heated. She turned off the stove without breaking eye contact. Then she asked the question I had been unconsciously dreading for days. What's happening to you? No accusation, no anger. That made it worse, because now honesty became theoretically possible. And I didn't know how to explain a collapse. I couldn't fully understand myself. I opened my mouth, closed it again. She waited. I could feel her trying not to pressure me, trying not to move too quickly, like approaching a wounded animal. I don't feel real anymore, I said finally. The sentence landed heavily between us. Not dramatic. Dense. Her expression changed immediately. Fear. Not theatrical fear. Quiet fear. Kind people try to hide because acknowledging it makes situations real. What does that mean? I laughed once, softly, without humor. That's the problem. I don't know, she stepped closer carefully. I think you're overwhelmed. No, too fast, too sharp. She stopped moving. I lowered my voice. It's deeper than that, then help me understand. I looked at her. Really look. And suddenly I saw exhaustion underneath everything else. Weeks of tension. Of monitoring me, of trying to determine whether this was temporary, fixable, recoverable. She looked tired in a way that made guilt slide through me like rusted metal. But beneath the guilt, another feeling remained. Resentment. Because even now, part of me felt she was trying to restore functionality rather than understand destruction. You ever feel like your personality is just accumulated survival strategies? I asked quietly. She frowned slightly. What, like there's no core underneath? Just adaptation stacked on adaptation. You're spiraling. The moment she said it, something inside me recoiled violently. Not because she was wrong. Because of the tone. Gentle reduction. Containment. Translation. Take the existential terror and make it manageable. Stress. Burnout. Spiraling. I could feel myself withdrawing internally, even while standing in front of her. You think this is temporary, I whispered. I think you're not okay. That's not the same thing. Then what is it? I didn't answer. Because the truth sounded insane, even inside my own head now. I think I disappeared years ago and only noticed recently. I think I became a reflection organism. I think every relationship slowly edits identity, until authenticity becomes impossible. I think I don't know which thoughts are mine anymore. Instead, I said, "You told me I'd never change." Her face tightened immediately. So this is about proving something? No, but even saying it, I wasn't completely sure. Because somewhere underneath all this psychological collapse lived something uglier, a need. Not just to change, to become unrecognizable, to break every expectation she had about me so violently that she would finally have to see me again instead of looking through me. That realization made me feel sick, because it meant even my transformation might still revolve around her perception. Maybe I wasn't escaping dependency. Maybe I was mutating inside it. She stepped closer again, slower this time. "You're scaring me." The honesty in her voice cut through me immediately. Real fear, real vulnerability, not manipulation. And suddenly the room became emotionally unstable, because now I could either comfort her or continue falling. I wanted to comfort her. God, I wanted to. I wanted to wrap my arms around her and dissolve this entire nightmare into exhaustion and tears and apology. But another part of me watched that impulse with suspicion, because comforting her meant returning. Returning meant stabilization. Stabilization meant becoming legible again. And I no longer trusted the version of me that existed inside legibility. So I stayed still. That hurt her instantly. I saw it happen. A tiny collapse behind the eyes. People don't realize how loud emotional withholding becomes once intimacy has trained someone to expect reassurance. She swallowed hard. "Talk to me," I stared at her. And suddenly I noticed something devastating. She still thought this was happening between us, but it wasn't anymore. That was the horror. The center of the collapse had moved inward. She was no longer the cause, only the witness. "I don't know how," I admitted. The room fell silent again. The food behind her cooled slowly on the stove. Outside, water dripped rhythmically from the fire escape. Somewhere in another apartment, someone laughed loudly at a television. Ordinary life continuing all around us. Meanwhile, my identity felt like wet paper tearing apart internally. She looked at me for a long time, then quietly asked, "Do you still love me?" The question hollowed the air, because the truthful answer was impossible to explain. Yes and no, and something worse than both. I loved. The version of me that loved her felt unreachable now, buried beneath observation and dissociation and panic, like emotional signals struggling through damaged wiring. "I don't know what I feel," I whispered. The moment the sentence left my mouth, I saw the damage. Not dramatic. Much worse. Stillness. Absolute stillness. She nodded once. Tiny. Controlled. Then she looked away from me for the first time since I entered the apartment. That hurt more than if she'd screamed. "You should eat," she said quietly. And suddenly the conversation was over. Not resolved. Abandoned. Like two people walking away from a car crash, still too shocked to understand what happened. We ate at the table in near silence. The sound of silverware touching plates became unbearable. Every tiny noise amplified. She barely looked at me now, and I realized with growing horror that I missed being watched. Even scrutiny felt better than absence. That realization disgusted me, because it confirmed something I'd been avoiding. I didn't know how to exist without external definition. Maybe none of us do. Maybe identity is partially created through reflected attention, and maybe losing that reflection creates psychological freefall. Halfway through dinner, she finally spoke. "Have you talked to anyone about this?" I knew what she meant immediately. Therapist, doctor, diagnose, containment. "No, you should." There was genuine care in her voice. That almost made it worse, because now I could feel myself splitting emotionally in opposite directions simultaneously. Part of me wanted rescue desperately. The other part viewed rescue as annihilation. If someone repaired this fracture, would I simply become the old version again? Would the comfortable personality reseal itself around me permanently? I couldn't bear the thought. "I'm figuring it out," I said. "You're getting worse." I looked up sharply. Worse. The word echoed strangely. Objective. Clinical. Like she'd been tracking symptoms privately. "What does worse mean?" She hesitated. "Then, you look at things differently now." "What things?" "Everything." Her voice became quieter. "Sometimes it feels like you're studying the room instead of being in it." The accuracy of that observation sent coldness through my chest. Because she was right. I had stopped participating naturally in reality. Everything now passed through analysis first. Tone, gesture, subtext, meaning. Nothing felt immediate anymore. Only interpreted. It feels like you're somewhere else, she whispered. I stared at her, and suddenly exhaustion crashed through me with crushing force. Not physical exhaustion, ontological exhaustion, the unbearable fatigue of constant self-monitoring. I pushed my plate away. I don't know how to come back. The vulnerability in my own voice startled me. For a second, she looked like she might cry. Instead, she stood abruptly. I can't do this tonight. Then she walked into the bedroom and closed the door. Not slammed, closed. That restraint hurt more. I remained at the table alone. The apartment felt cavernous now. The untouched food, the cooling wine sauce, the soft refrigerator hum. Everything looked painfully real and strangely artificial at the same time. I sat there for a long time, listening. No movement from the bedroom. Eventually I stood and walked to the door. My hand hovered near the handle. I imagined opening it, lying beside her, apologizing, allowing myself to collapse completely into grief and fear and dependence. Maybe that was the healthy choice. Maybe this entire transformation was just breakdown disguised as awakening. But another thought emerged immediately after. What if returning now means losing whatever truth this pain uncovered? I stepped away from the door, slowly, like retreating from a ledge. That was the moment I understood how far gone I really was. Because I chose uncertainty over comfort. I chose fragmentation over restoration. Not confidently, not triumphantly, compulsively, like some deeper process had already decided for me. I slept on the couch that night, or tried to. The darkness felt crowded. Every sound in the apartment carried emotional meaning now. The pipe, the settling wood, her footsteps once around 2A, them pausing outside the bedroom, not coming farther, then retreating again. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling my own mind turning against itself in slow mechanical revolution. At some point before dawn, I realized something terrifying. I no longer trusted my memories emotionally. I remembered events, but not the authenticity of the self experiencing them. Every past version of me now felt partially fictional, constructed for context, adapted for survival. Even childhood memories had started feeling distant and performative, like watching archived footage of someone learning how to become acceptable. I pressed both hands against my face hard enough to hurt, trying to force myself back into physical sensation. Again, bone, pressure, something real. But even pain felt strangely observational now. Morning arrived colorlessly, weak gray light filling the apartment inch by inch. I heard her moving around the bedroom quietly, drawers opening, closet doors sliding. The sounds felt unbearably intimate from a distance. Then silence again. Then footsteps. She appeared in the hallway already dressed for work, holding her bag against her side. She looked exhausted, and older somehow, as if the last few weeks had removed softness from her face, one invisible layer at a time. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally she asked, "Are you going to work?" "I think so." Another silence. Then, "I don't know what to do anymore." The honesty in that sentence nearly broke me. Because I believed her. This wasn't manipulation. She was genuinely reaching the edge of comprehension. And suddenly I saw the entire situation from outside myself for one terrible moment. A woman watching someone she loves become psychologically unreachable in slow motion. No clear explanation. No visible wound. Just gradual estrangement. Identity dissolving behind familiar eyes. I wanted to tell her she wasn't failing. That maybe nobody could have prevented this. But even that felt uncertain now. Maybe this collapse had been building for years underneath both our silences. She looked at me one last time. Long, searching, as if trying desperately to locate the version of me she still recognized. Whatever she saw, it wasn't enough. She nodded faintly, then left. The lock clicked shut, and the apartment became silent again. I stood motionless in the gray morning light, completely alone. But the strangest part was this. I no longer knew whether that terrified me or relieved me. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars, voices, Rain beginning again softly against the windows. Inside the apartment, her coffee cup still sat beside the sink. A strand of her hair remained caught in the couch fabric. The bedroom still smelled faintly like her shampoo. Evidence everywhere. Presence without proximity. I walked slowly to the hallway mirror one final time. Unstared. Long enough for the reflection to stop feeling immediate. Long enough for it to become just another person looking back. The frightening thing was, I couldn't tell anymore whether I had changed into someone new. Or simply stripped away so much performance that nothing coherent remained underneath. And somewhere deep inside that uncertainty, beneath the fear, beneath the grief, beneath the dissolving identity, something cold and quiet continued unfolding anyway.